The human is teaching the Empress dangerous ideas. Lord Vareth's accusation echoed through the crystalline halls of the Thalvori High Council, his violet eyes fixed on the lone figure standing in chains at the center of the chamber. Marcus Cole did not flinch. He had learned long ago that showing fear only sharpened the blades of those who sought to cut you down. Empress Sealith sat upon the throne of echoes, her silver skin catching the light of 1,000 bioluminescent orbs suspended above. Her expression remained as still as carved stone, but Marcus had spent 3 months in her court. He knew the subtle tension in her jaw, the almost imperceptible narrowing of her obsidian eyes. She was furious. "Explain yourself, human," Lord Vareth continued, his ceremonial robe sweeping across the floor as he circled Marcus like a predator. "You were brought here as a cultural liaison." Curiosity. "And yet you have poisoned the mind of our eternal sovereign with your barbaric philosophies." "I taught her nothing," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the weight of the gravitational restraints pressing against his wrists. "I answered her questions." A murmur rippled through the assembled nobility. The Thalvori did not appreciate directness. Their entire civilization was built upon layers of implication, inference, and carefully constructed ambiguity. Marcus had never been good at that game. "You taught her the word no." Lord Vareth spat the syllable as though it were a curse. "You taught her that she could refuse." "She always could," Marcus replied. "I simply reminded her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Among the Thalvori, an empress did not refuse. She accepted. She endured. She embodied the will of the collective, channeling the desires of her people through her own vessel until nothing of her original self remained. It was considered the highest honor, to become everyone by becoming no one. Marcus thought it was a slow, elegant form of murder. "Lord Vareth." The Empress's voice was soft, musical, carrying the harmonic undertones of her species. But there was something else beneath it now. Something that hadn't been there 3 months ago. "You speak of the human as though he committed treason. Yet I do not recall summoning you to speak on my behalf." The Lord's violet skin paled to lavender. "Eternal One, I merely, you presume." Sealith rose from her throne, and the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. "You presume to know what I have been taught. You presume to know what I think. You presume that your interpretation of my sacred duty supersedes my own understanding of it." She descended the steps slowly, her flowing gown trailing behind her like liquid moonlight. Every movement was precise, deliberate, the product of centuries of training. But when she reached Marcus and placed her hand upon his shoulder, there was nothing rehearsed about it. "Release him, Empress," another lord began. "I said release him." The gravitational restraints dissolved. Marcus felt the blood rush back into his hands, but he did not move. He had learned that much at least. Among the Thalvori, sudden movements were considered either aggressive or insane. "This human," Sealith announced, turning to face her council, "has served me with more honesty than any of you have shown in the 300 years of my reign. He does not seek my favor. He does not scheme for position. When I ask him a question, he answers it, not with the answer he believes I wish to hear, but with the truth as he understands it." "That is precisely the problem," Lord Vareth hissed. "His truth is contamination. His species knows nothing of harmony, of collective purpose. They are fractured, chaotic, driven by individual desires that what?" Marcus interrupted, and several nobles gasped at his audacity. "That make them free?" Lord Vareth's eyes burned with barely contained rage. You see the disrespect, the arrogance? I see a man who is not afraid of you," the Empress said quietly. "And I wonder why that frightens you so much, Lord Vareth." The Lord had no response. He simply stood there, trembling with an emotion the Thalvori were never supposed to display publicly. "This council is dismissed," Sealith declared. "The human remains under my personal protection. Any who move against him move against me." One by one the nobles filed out, their whispers filling the air like the hiss of disturbed serpents. Only when the last of them had departed did the Empress allow her posture to soften, her shoulders dropping just slightly. "You should not have spoken," she said, though her tone carried no reproach. "They will use it against you. They were already going to use everything against me, Marcus replied. At least, this way, I got to say something true. The ghost of a smile crossed her silver lips. You humans. You speak of truth as though it were simple. Sometimes it is. He met her eyes. Something else the Thalvori considered inappropriate between those of different stations. Sometimes the hardest part is just saying it out loud. Salith was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something that Marcus had never seen her do in the 3 months he had known her. She laughed. It was soft, almost soundless, but unmistakably genuine. 300 years, she murmured. 300 years I have sat upon that throne, channeling the will of trillions. And in 3 months, you have given me something none of them ever could. What's that? She looked at him, and for the first time he saw not the Empress of the Thalvori collective, but a woman. Ancient, lonely, and desperately tired. Doubt, she said. You gave me doubt. Marcus wasn't sure if that was a gift or a curse. But as he looked at her standing there in the empty chamber, stripped of ceremony and pretense, he thought that maybe it was both. The Empress's private gardens were forbidden to all but her closest attendants. Marcus had been surprised when she summoned him there, and more surprised still when she dismissed the guards who typically shadowed her every movement. They think you've bewitched me, Salith said, walking among the luminescent flowers that bloomed in impossible colors. Some form of human telepathy they claim your species has been hiding from the galactic community. Humans aren't telepathic, Marcus said, following at a respectful distance. We can barely understand each other most of the time, I know. She paused beside a tree whose leaves chimed softly in a breeze that Marcus couldn't feel. I have read extensively about your species since you arrived. Your histories, your philosophies, your art. You are a confusing people. We get that a lot. She turned to face him, her obsidian eyes searching his features with an intensity that made him want to look away. He didn't. You wage wars over resources you could share, she said. You destroy your own environment knowing full well the consequences. You treat each other with cruelty that serves no collective purpose. And yet you also love, she continued softly. Not the way we do. Not as a function of biological compatibility and genetic optimization. You love irrationally. Inconveniently. You love people who hurt you. You love against your own interests. She shook her head slowly. I do not understand it. Marcus considered his response carefully. Neither do we most of the time. But that's sort of the point. The point of what? Of being human. He took a step closer, close enough that he could see the subtle patterns swirling beneath her silver skin, like galaxies in miniature. We don't love because it makes sense. We love because we can't help it. Because something in us reaches out towards something in someone else, and the connection that forms, it's not logical. It's not efficient, but it's real. Salith was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I have never loved anyone. The admission hung in the air between them. Marcus understood the weight of it. For a Thalvori to admit to lacking something was almost unthinkable. For an Empress to do so was unprecedented. The collective chose my mates, she continued. 3 consorts, selected for their genetic contributions to the next generation. I have borne 7 children, all of whom were taken from me at birth to be raised according to their designated roles. I do not know their names. I am not permitted to. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. It is our way, she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. It has always been our way. The Empress is not a person. She is a conduit, a symbol. She exists to embody the will of the many. Her own desires are irrelevant. No one's desires are irrelevant. You see? A bitter edge crept into her tone. This is what they mean when they say you teach me dangerous ideas. You make me question things I was never meant to question. Maybe they weren't meant to go unquestioned. She stared at him, and he saw something flicker in her eyes. A spark that had been smothered for centuries, struggling to reignite. My 3rd consort, she said slowly. He was kind, gentler than the others. When he was decommissioned, after fulfilling his purpose, I felt something. A heaviness here. She pressed her hand to her chest. I did not understand it then. I thought perhaps I was malfunctioning. You weren't malfunctioning, Marcus said quietly. You were grieving. Grieving. She tested the word as though it were foreign. Is that what it was? I think so. She looked at him with something approaching wonder. How do you bear it? This feeling? If this is what losing someone is like, how do humans survive it? You lose so many. Your lives are so short, and yet you form these attachments knowing they will end in pain. Marcus thought of his mother who had died when he was 12. His father, who had followed her 4 years later, of a broken heart. His grandmother had said, though the doctors called it cancer. He thought of Elena, his fiancée, who had been on the transport ship that the Thalvori had accidentally destroyed 6 years ago, killing 3,000 humans in what the galactic courts had ruled an unfortunate misunderstanding. Well, bear it because the alternative is worse, he said finally. To never love at all, to go through life without ever really connecting to another person, that's not living. That's just existing. Salith reached out slowly as though approaching something that might shatter at her touch. Her fingers brushed against his hand, cool and smooth like polished stone. Show me, she whispered. Teach me how to live. Marcus knew he should refuse. He was a human in an alien court, surrounded by enemies who would gladly see him dead. Getting emotionally involved with the Empress was the height of stupidity. It would only give them more ammunition against him. But when he looked into her eyes and saw the hunger there, not for power or pleasure, but for something far more fundamental, he couldn't bring himself to pull away. It starts with choices, he said. Small ones. What do you want right now? Not what the collective wants. Not what the council expects. What do you want? She considered the question with the gravity of someone who had never been asked it before. I want to stay here, she said finally, in this garden. With you. I want to ask you more questions. I want to understand why your hand feels warm when everything else feels cold. Then stay, Marcus said simply. And for the first time in 300 years, Empress Salith of the Thalvori Collective did exactly what she wanted. The assassination attempt came 3 weeks later. Marcus was in his quarters when he heard the commotion, shouts in the harmonic language of the Thalvori, followed by the unmistakable sound of energy weapons discharging. He grabbed the makeshift blade he'd fashioned from a piece of broken furniture and ran. The halls of the palace were chaos. Guards lay scattered across the crystalline floor, their violet blood pooling beneath them. Marcus followed the sounds of fighting until he reached the Empress's chambers. Lord Vareth stood at the center of the room, a contingent of armed nobles behind him. Salith was pressed against the far wall, her attendants forming a protective barrier around her. But they were unarmed, trained only in ceremony, not combat. The collective has spoken, Vareth declared, his voice ringing with fanatical conviction. The Empress has been corrupted. The contamination must be purged. The collective has not spoken, Salith replied, and Marcus heard the fear beneath her controlled tone. You speak only for yourself and your conspirators. We speak for tradition, for purity, for everything you have betrayed with your obsession with that human animal. Marcus didn't think. He moved. The first guard didn't see him coming. Marcus drove the blade into the gap between his armor plates and twisted, dropping him before the others could react. The second guard swung his weapon around, but Marcus was already inside his reach, using the fallen guard's body as a shield while he wrenched the energy rifle free. He wasn't a soldier. He'd never been trained for combat, but he'd grown up in the outer colonies where survival meant learning to fight dirty. And he'd spent 6 years carrying a rage that had no outlet, until now. 3 more guards fell before they managed to wound him. The energy bolt caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. But he'd bought enough time. Palace security was flooding into the chamber, overwhelming the conspirators. Lord Vareth saw his rebellion crumbling and made one last desperate move. He lunged toward the Empress, a ceremonial blade appearing in his hand. Marcus threw himself forward, tackling Vareth before he could reach her. They crashed to the floor together, struggling for control of the weapon. Vareth was stronger. The Thalvori were denser, their muscles more efficient than human tissue. But Marcus had something Vareth didn't. He no longer cared whether he lived or died. He headbutted Vareth with all his strength, feeling his nose shatter against the alien's skull. The pain was blinding, but it loosened Vareth's grip enough for Marcus to wrench the blade away. He pressed it to Vareth's throat, breathing hard, blood streaming down his face. "Yield," he gasped. Vareth stared up at him with pure hatred. "You have destroyed everything. You have taken our Empress from us. She was never yours to take." The guards pulled Marcus off before he could do something he might regret. Or might not. He wasn't sure anymore. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the searing agony of his wounded shoulder and broken nose. Then Salith was there, kneeling beside him on the blood-soaked floor, her hands cupping his face with a tenderness that seemed impossible from someone who had never learned to touch. "You're hurt," she said, and there was panic in her voice. Raw, unfiltered emotion that a Thalvori Empress was never supposed to display. "I've had worse," he lied. "You could have died." "Yeah." He tried to smile, though it hurt. That was sort of the point. Why? Her obsidian eyes were wet with something Marcus had never seen on a Thalvori face. Tears. "Why would you risk your life for me?" He reached up with his good hand and wiped the moisture from her cheek. "'Cause you're worth it. Because somewhere along the way you stopped being the Empress and started being Salith. And Salith is the most remarkable person I've ever met." "I'm not a person," she whispered. "I'm a symbol. A conduit. That's all I've ever been." "No, D." He shook his head, ignoring the fresh wave of pain it caused. "That's all they ever let you be. But you're so much more than that. You're curious and kind and achingly lonely. And you've spent 300 years being told that your feelings don't matter." "They do, Salith. They matter to me." She broke then. The mask she had worn for 3 centuries cracked and fell away, and she collapsed against his chest, sobbing with the accumulated grief of a lifetime. Her attendants watched in stunned silence. The guard stood uncertain, not knowing what to do with an Empress who wept openly. Marcus held her as best he could with one working arm, stroking her silver hair and murmuring soft words that didn't matter. Only the sound mattered, only the presence. "I don't know how to do this," she said between sobs. "I don't know how to feel. It hurts so much." "I know," he said. "That means you're doing it right." The trial of Lord Vareth and his conspirators lasted 7 days. In the end, they were sentenced to the severance, permanent disconnection from the collective consciousness, the harshest punishment in Thalvori law. They would live out their remaining years as isolated individuals, cut off from the mental network that had sustained them since birth. Some called it mercy. Marcus thought it was poetic justice. The political fallout was enormous. The Empress had publicly wept. She had embraced a human. She had demonstrated emotions that the collective deemed weaknesses. By all precedent, she should have been removed from power, her consciousness dissolved into the greater whole. Instead, something unexpected happened. The younger generation of Thalvori, those who had grown up with more exposure to alien species, who had begun to question the rigid structures of their society, rallied to her support. They flooded the council with demands for reform. They spoke openly about feelings, about individual desires, about the right to choose one's own path. The human, they said, had taught the Empress to say no. And in doing so, he had taught an entire generation that they could say no too. Marcus watched the protests from the window of his new quarters, larger and more comfortable than his previous cell, though still technically within the palace complex. His shoulder had healed, thanks to Thalvori medical technology. His nose remained slightly crooked. He'd decided to keep it that way. "They're calling you a revolutionary," Salith said, appearing beside him. She moved differently now, less rigidly, more naturally. The ceremonial gowns had been replaced by simpler clothing that allowed for actual movement. "I'm just a guy who answered some questions. You're being modest." She slipped her hand into his, and he felt the familiar coolness of her skin, warmer now than it had been weeks ago. Or maybe he was just more used to it. "You changed everything. You changed everything," he corrected. "I just reminded you that you could." She was quiet for a moment, watching the crowds below. Then she turned to face him, and there was something new in her expression, a certainty that hadn't been there before. "The council has agreed to my terms," she said. "Limited reforms. Greater individual autonomy for those who choose it. It's not everything, but it's a beginning. That's incredible. There's one more thing. She took a breath and he noticed the slight tremor in her hand. I've informed them that I will be taking a new consort. Not chosen by the collective. Chosen by me. Marcus felt his heart stop. Seelith, you once asked me what I wanted, she said. Right now, I want you to know that I've spent 300 years doing my duty. I've borne children I was never allowed to love. I've ruled an empire that treated me as a symbol rather than a person. I've never once chosen anything for myself. She lifted his hand to her chest, pressing it against the place where her hearts beat in double time. I choose you. If you'll have me. The council will never accept it. A human consort to the Empress. The council doesn't have to accept it. I do. She smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. You taught me to say no, Marcus. You taught me that my desires matter. Did you mean it? Or were those just words? He looked at her, this impossible woman who had ruled an empire and been ruled by it, who had spent centuries as a vessel for others and was only now learning to be herself. He thought about Elena, about the life he'd lost, about the rage that had sustained him through 6 bitter years. The rage was gone. In its place was something else, something terrifying and wonderful and completely irrational. I meant it, he said. Every word. She kissed him then, soft and uncertain, learning the gesture from books she'd read about human customs. It wasn't perfect. Their noses bumped. She wasn't entirely sure where to put her hands, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that made it more than perfect. When they finally parted, she rested her forehead against his, her cool breath mingling with his warm one. They will say I've gone mad, she murmured. That the human corrupted me beyond repair. What will you say? She laughed. That soft, almost soundless sound that he had learned to treasure. I'll say he taught me something dangerous. He taught me to say no to everything that was killing me slowly. And for the first time in 300 years, I said yes to living. Marcus held her close, watching the sun of an alien world set beyond the crystalline spires of the palace. Below them, a revolution of the heart was spreading through the streets. Thalvori, embracing emotions they'd been taught to suppress, choosing connections over conformity, discovering that the terrifying freedom of individual desire was also its own kind of salvation. He had come to this world as a prisoner, a curiosity, a representative of a species the galaxy considered barbaric. He would leave it, if he ever chose to leave, as something far more important. He had taught an empress to say no, and in her yes, he had found his home.